In this video, I'm going to explain the agenda setting effect using the memory-based model, because I've been saying all along that that's a good way to understand the power of the media is by taking the memory-based model and applying it to media effects. So this PowerPoint presentation is obviously going to be very visual. And I think it's really important to keep in mind that I do this because there are some students who learn visually really well. You know, some students like text and they're better with words. Some people like pictures, they're better with that. And so I'm trying to accommodate a variety of learning styles. But at the same time, it's important to keep in mind that some students can't see or have their vision impaired. And so as a result, when I go through these visual presentations, I'm going to do it in a step-by-step way to help to help any student who might be vision impaired, help them better be able to visualize what I'm talking about. So on the screen, what you're looking at is a silhouette of a head. I don't know if that's a male or a female. It's just a line drawing. And I have circles that represent the top of the head and the back of the head. And what for the purposes of this presentation, what I'm going to assume is the attitudes in the top of the head and the back of the head refer to which issues this person thinks are the most important issues of the day. That's a question that's frequently asked on public opinion polls. And so right now, if you take what's in the top of this person's head and the back of this person's head, there are two attitudes about climate change being the most important issue, two about the economy being the important issue, two about terrorism, and one on immigration. Now, if this person were to be at home, let me move my head out of the way there. This person was at home and Gallup called up and they agreed to be part of a survey. One of the questions that Gallup typically asks is, what's the most important issue of the day? Now, again, we know the memory-based model. We've studied the memory-based model. Well, what would happen? This person would take a random sample of attitudes, mostly from the top of the head, not so much from the back of the head, and based on that, they would express an opinion. And so what I've done is I've circled the attitudes that this person presumably randomly sampled. And what did they sample? One attitude about, excuse me, one attitude about climate change, one about the economy, one about terrorism, and one about immigration. The immigration was something they sampled from the back of the head. Well, now they have one of each. They've just been asked, what's the most important issue of the day by the good people at Gallup? And so they say, I'm not sure, because they've randomly sampled each one of them. So they just have to give a non-committal answer. Now, let's go back to the beginning. This is the same person with two attitudes about climate change in the front and back of their head combined, two about the economy, two on terrorism, and one on immigration. But in this case, this person who is kind of ambivalent, not even kind of ambivalent, is ambivalent as to what is the most important issue of the day, right? Let's say they're driving home from work and the radio's on, and whomever the radio is on, who's talking on the radio, they're talking about climate change. That's represented by the CC next to the microphone. The microphone is representing the news media. I know it's kind of old-fashioned, but I think that's kind of a cool image, so I'm using that. And so they hear a report on climate change, and now you can see that there's one additional attitude at the top of their head because they've just heard a report about climate change. And then the reporting continues on, and they mention another thing about climate change, and now they have four attitudes, three at the top of the head, one at the back of the head. And then The news they're listening to mentions climate change again, and now climate change is even more so at the top of the head. And then there's a report about the economy, and you can see that now there's an additional attitude about the economy being the most important issue at the top of their head. And then one more report on climate change, and now here's this person after listening to the news, because now this new information, because people who are ambivalent don't counter argue, they're just taking in all this information. They have 6 attitudes about climate change, 3 about the economy, 2 about terrorism, and 1 about immigration. And now they get home, and sure enough, the phone rings and it's Gallup. This person gets called all the time by Gallup. And Gallup asks them all the questions that you have to ask to make sure that they're appropriate for the survey. Once they make that determination, they ask them, what's the most important issue of the day? Well, now this person's going to do the same thing that we've been talking about all along. They're going to take a random sample of attitudes, mostly from the top of the head, not so much from the back of the head, and then based on that sample, they're going to express an opinion. This is the substance of the memory-based model. And so in this next picture, what I've shown is the circles around each of the attitudes that this hypothetical person randomly sampled. And what you can see is that they've sampled 4 attitudes about climate change, 2 attitudes about the economy, nothing about terrorism or immigration. And so now they can answer the question, climate change. What's the most important issue of the day? Climate change. This is how the memory-based model works. So we can understand the agenda setting effect by understanding the memory-based model. When this person started off, before they turned on the radio, because they were basically ambivalent, but after listening to a bunch of reports on climate change and one on the economy, now climate change is at the top of their head, so they answer climate change. And this could be, for example, after a weather event that people have attributed to climate change. So there's a lot of coverage about a city being underwater or a terrible rainstorm. So when, like as I say, Gallup asked them the question, and now they can say climate change. Now, let's go back to the beginning, the person I described at the very beginning, where they have 2 attitudes about climate change, 2 about the economy, 2 about terrorism, and 1 about immigration. And you can probably tell from past presentations how this is going to go. Now, when they're listening to the radio, this is a different day. On the radio, they're talking about the economy. And so you can see an E that stands for the economy coming out of the microphone. And now they have an additional attitude about the economy at the top of their head. The more they listen, the more there's a discussion about the economy. Maybe something has happened in the news. Maybe the unemployment rate has gone up dramatically, or inflation has gone up dramatically, or maybe there's been a drop in the stock market. So they're still listening to the radio, and there's more discussion about the economy. And now you can see, whereas they started off with 2 attitudes about climate change, 2 about the economy, 2 about terrorism, and 1 about immigration, now they have 5 attitudes about the economy being the most important issue of the day, and everything else has stayed the same. The news report talks about it again, the economy. Now they have 6 attitudes about the economy being the most important issue of the day, 5 at the top of the head, 1 at the back of the head. Then sure enough, Gallup calls them up. They ask them, what's the most important issue of the day? What are they going to do? They're going to take a random sample of attitudes, mostly from the top of the head, not so much from the back of the head, and they're going to express an opinion. So in this case, the random sample yields 5 attitudes about the economy being the most important issue of the day, 1 about climate change, and 1 about terrorism, nothing about immigration. And so they answer the economy. Now before, the first time when I went through this simulation, they said climate change. But this time, because they're ambivalent, because they don't counter argue, they're taking in all the information that they're hearing on the news, and now at the top of their head, there's all kinds of stuff about the economy. Therefore, the economy is the most important issue of the day after they do their random sample. What this shows, I hope, is that People who are ambivalent can clearly be influenced by the economy. Now, we don't know how long those attitudes will stay at the top of the head. That maybe they'll drift down to the back of the head. Maybe this person will be more ambivalent if they hear a different radio program that talks about immigration and then something else that talks about terrorism. But for right now, this person has a whole lot of the economy on the top of their head. But what about people who are univalent? The picture on the screen is intended to note somebody who's univalent on the issue of climate change. In other words, when you ask this person what's the most important issue of the day, it's pretty clear how they're going to answer. If you look at the top of the head and the back of the head, they have 19 attitudes about climate change as being the most important issue, 2 about the economy, 2 about terrorism, and 1 on immigration. This person's got really strong views. Will news coverage be able to affect this person? No, it won't, because they can talk about the economy being the most important issue of the day, and maybe they'll accept some of it, but they're going to counter-argue anything that suggests that climate change isn't the most important issue of the day. If they talk about immigration, they're going to counter-argue that. This is what univalent people do. They're going to counter-argue and say, no, that's not nearly, it's important, but it's not nearly as important to climate change. And so when this person is asked to take a random sample of attitudes, mostly from the top of the head and not so much from the back of the head, given that they have 19 attitudes about climate change being the most important issue, 15 of which are in the top of the head, this person is not going to be affected by whatever the media is covering. The media is covering the economy or war or the economy or immigration. They're going to counter-argue any suggestion that climate change is not the most important issue of the day. And so this is a clue as to where I'm going to be going with my discussion on the media. What I'm suggesting is that the media does not have a big impact on people who are univalent. It may strengthen their views, but it won't change their views. So if this person, for example, was listening to a bunch of news reports about the importance of climate change, we might see more and more attitudes about climate change being at the top of their head, right? But this person is not going to be accepting information in a way that's going to cause them to change their minds about the most important issue of the day. And that's the point I want to make about the media, but I'm also going to talk about it when I talk about other kinds of effects, priming effects as well. So we'll get to that in the next video.